So the government's recently put out a response publicly to the Senate inquiry into the state of game development in Australia. And I brought on Liam Esler from the Game Developers Association. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, absolutely, anytime.
So I figured we'd talk a little bit about what the response has been and why game devs in particular aren't super pleased with the response. So I guess to sort of fill in the context, would you mind speaking a little bit to what the Senate inquiry was for originally?
Sure. So in 2015, Senator Ludlam actually decided that the state of the games industry from a government perspective in Australia wasn't ideal, and he felt that the government needed to take a stronger hand in supporting the industry. And so the way that he did this was by starting a Senate inquiry. He put together a panel of different senators and ministers from across the political spectrum.
Right.
And then they went all around the country and talked to game developers from every stripe. And compiled a report that was then filed to Senator Fifield's office.
And so that was in April of, it was in early sort of 2016, I believe.
Yes.
And so the industry was waiting for a response for quite a while after that.
It was over 600 days.
Over 600 days. The original deadline was, I believe it was in 2016, but it's long past that.
We slid past that somewhat, yeah.
The response from game devs to the government's response from Senator Fifield was that they weren't particularly interested in supporting the industry as much as they would have liked. I imagine that Senator Ludlam would have liked.
Yes.
So what was the sort of overall sort of tone of that response?
So the government's response was lacking in some areas, let's say.
Right.
So the government decided that they agreed with several of the points that the inquiry raised. There was one point that they 100% agreed with, but then felt that the industry should handle.
Right.
And there were a couple of points that they felt like would be worth exploring. Plus, at the end of the report, the National Broadband Network came up, and apparently everything's going great. So it's good to know, because I do know a couple of developers who have to mail USBs to each other instead of actually using the Australian internet, which is unfortunate.
That's a reality that we live with. So one of the bigger I guess reasons for why the inquiry was begun originally was because there was federal government funding from Screen Australia into game development costs. That was at a certain point revoked in some sense?
Yes, it was axed when the new government came in.
And so when the inquiry was like, hey, maybe we should reinstate this, their response was more or less, no, there are other initiatives that you can sort of explore. And what were they? Like, was it more or less like other initiatives for the IT industry, for other innovation industries?
There are some few sources of funding that the games industry can tap into, but most of those aren't actually relevant to a lot of what we do.
Okay.
Which is unfortunate, and it makes it difficult as game developers in Australia to sort of begin and start up, because we have a very different business model to traditional startups. And while the government acknowledges this, they've struggled to find ways to address it.
And so outside of obviously we've got other initiatives, we've got other stuff nationally that you might be able to tap into. As far as what Film Victoria has previously provided, that's really been a catalyst for a lot of what's happened in Melbourne, I imagine.
Yeah,
absolutely. Is that what you've seen from your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. Film Victoria's support of the Victorian industry has been exceptional from the get-go. And they knew what they were doing when they decided they were going to support the industry. And as a result, about 40% of the Australian industry is now based in Victoria. But from that example, now we have other state governments that are beginning to seriously look at games.
Yeah, so it's like the area in like the space in South Australia that's recently been started, and then we're seeing Screen Queensland starting to kickstart this stuff. So I guess
Screen Tasmania as well.
Screen Tasmania as well, yeah. So like outside of the state funding, which is obviously a huge part of why there's 40% of the industry in Victoria, do we necessarily, like, for people that aren't super familiar with why we would need federal funding, why should that be there if the states are already trying to, like, kind of taking care of that?
So the states tend to be really good for startup funding. So to start your project out, to build your prototype so that then you can get larger amounts of funding.
Right.
And they're really good for that smaller stuff. But we have a number of studios in Australia right now that are at the point where they need more significant capital in order to expand.
Right.
They need enterprise level funding, which is part of what the original government fund included.
That was there, yeah.
But unfortunately, it was axed. And so we now have this small group of companies that are on the verge of becoming something much bigger, something much better, and employing a lot more people. But they're not able to do that without more capital. So what would be ideal is if like Senator Fifield and the Office of Arts and Communication and the Arts, were to put together some kind of fund that that addressed some of the problems with the original fund,
right.
And looked at this issue in a new way.
So I guess where do we go from here? Like, if a big part of this was obviously the Game Developers Association sort of working with the government and trying to help them appreciate the gravity of the situation. Is that really, like, are we still more or less on square one on that front? Like,
no,
does
absolutely.
this response change much?
Look, this response was really disappointing for a lot of people in the industry. It was certainly not what we all hoped for. And that sucks. That's really unfortunate. However, there have been ongoing discussions between the Game Developers Association of Australia and Senator Fifield's office and many, many state offices for quite some time. And the report is one part of a broader strategy that includes much more than that. And these conversations will continue. From what I've heard, they've been fairly positive, which is really exciting. So, you know, we're hopeful. Like, and I know that Tony Reid at the GDAA is incredibly hopeful that we're going to see something more over, you know, the next year or two, as particularly when we have the government changeover. Hopefully something can be done after that point.
So, you know, sort of watch this space, see what comes of it.
Watch this space, see what comes of it. You know, mail in to all of your local politicians, ask them to support the games industry so that we can make the best games in the world.